Welcome to chess, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. So this is the light analysis from Wesley So versus Hikaru Nakamura from chess.com Rapid Chess Championship. This is week 25. So this is the only game they played against each other right now. Yeah, we're going to get straight to the point in this one. It's going to be considerably shorter than probably normal. But all of my people that are coming from the Philippines, I will say mabuhay to you. Meron salamat, aking makaibigan. I appreciate you guys very much. But if you guys are ready to roll, let's see what we got rolling. So we got the move E5, E4, E5, sorry. Knight to F3, we got knight to C6, bishop to C4, knight to F6, we got D3, bishop to C5. So we have the Giuoco Pianissimo of the Giuoco piano game. We got castles by white. We got D6. We got C3. We don't want any knight shenanigans going on. Like none of the knights dropping in and being inconvenient and being on our side. Stay on your own side, bro. We got the move A6. We got rook over to E1. We got H6. Knight B to D2. So, you know, all standard stuff. A lot of maneuvering going on. So we do see bishop to A7. Bishop comes back to B3. We got castles by black. Knight comes down to F1. And this is definitely one of the plans, you know, for the white side, you know, have the knight come and live most likely on G3. But, you know, in some cases after, you know, if you bring the bishop to E3, the knight can't recapture there. And, you know, it just has like some, you know, some options as far as trying to jump into some squares. We do see the move for rook over to E8. We got H3. Bishop to G4 can be a little bit of a problem. So we do see the bishop back to E6. And Wesley So decides to just tuck his bishop down. You know, put it on that diagonal. You know, point at the king just a little bit. So we do see the pawn break D5. Perfectly timed pawn break. You do not want to allow white to push D4 at some point. And then after the pawn takes, and then white has a really nice pawn center. So D5 is just nicely timed. And then after the pawn takes, it activates the knight just a little bit more. So it puts it on a more central square. Knight takes D5. But as you can see, the structure is pretty much the same for both sides. No side has like, you know, a great center over the other one. And so we do see the move knight to G3. But backing up, if some of you were looking at the position and felt like you might can win a pawn, I will say in this particular position, that would be actually a very horrible blunder. Wouldn't be a game-ending blunder, but it's not quite the pawn you think it is. And I will show you guys what I mean. You guys might have been thinking, okay, knight takes E5, knight takes E5, rook takes E5, right? Like, I mean, I should be able to get a pawn, right? Well, the problem is bishop takes F2 with check. And this is kind of an exclam situation. You really kind of want to sidestep with the king. But if we do see king taking F2, you would be looking at queen to F6. No! Yes. This rook is going to cry for the rest of its life, which is short, because after the king moves or you block somehow, the queen is going to be taking the rook on E5. So we do not want to go down that path. So like I said, we did have Wesley So understanding this, so he went ahead and played knight to G3. We got queen down to D6, so now there's no more knight takes E5s. The knight does come to H4, rook A to D8, and we do have a really nice square for the knight to come into. Knight H comes into F5, attacks the queen. So we remove it with the bishop, and then we replace it with the other knight. And we are kind of inconveniencing this queen a little bit. The best square pretty much to go to is either F6 or G6. So Hikaru does choose the move H6. And we do develop queen to G4, partly to, you know, just defend the knight, but also to kind of develop a piece. And I mean, we're threatening checkmate. If black falls asleep, which Hikaru says, I'm not sleepy. So we are not dropping checkmate. We do see the move H5, which is the novelty of the game. So this is the first time we've seen that. We've seen knight C to E7, you know, just asking a real question to that knight. But we do see, you know, Hikaru's own creation with the pawn going to H5. We do see queen to G5, and the best possible way to get out of that is to take on G5 with the queen. Bishop takes, and then we do see the move F6, and this does back the bishop up to D2. We got the move G6. So we're just pushing all the white pieces around right now. Knight comes back to G3. We see king down to G7. We got the move A4. We got knight down to F4. Bishop takes, pawn takes, and then we do see the knight coming back to E4. We got rook over to E7. We got the move D4, kind of blocking that bishop on that diagonal. Because, you know, this is always a tender square, and so is F7, right? We do see rook D to E8. And you have to be kind of careful in this situation because if you don't defend this rook on E1 properly, F5 can come and it's going to knock this knight away. And the problem is you can't retreat it to a square that protects that E1 square. So you got to be kind of careful. So we do see the move king to F1. And this is just, making sure this rook is protected. If F5 does come, the knight moves somewhere, you have enough protection between this rook, and you will be good to go. So we have reached a point in the game that if you do want to pause the video, and there is a really nice move that Hikaru Nakamura finds in this position. Go ahead and pause the video and see if you can guess this move. Okay. Yeah, I mean, it might seem kind of surprising, but it does do a lot of undermining of the position for white, and it does, get you in a very legitimate position. So the move is bishop takes d4, exclaiming. I mean, it's kind of fairly even, but I mean, this does get you in a really nice position because after the pawn takes on d4, you do see knight to b4, and you have put this bishop on c2 in a little bit of a pickle. You absolutely do not want to go back to b1 because, of course, like I said before, the knight is not defended, and f5 is going to smash all of your dreams because now you're going to be losing your piece back. It's not like it's absolutely losing, but you are going to have to give this piece back because if not, you move the knight somewhere and you're just checkmated. And after we see knight to b4, of course, you can't go bishop to d3 because then it's just going to be gone. We don't want to do that, bro. So after we see knight to b4, Wesley just says, hey, man, I'm going to go ahead and give the piece back, and I'm going to not trip on it. The rook E comes to c1. We see knight taking c2, rook taking c2. And, of course, rook takes e4, and then we do see rook taking c7 with check. Rook 8 comes down to e7. We see rook takes e7, rook takes e7, and then rook down to d1. And even though this might look kind of scary for black, this is a very defendable position. And, one of the best ways to defend the position is what Nakamura actually does. And we see the move king to f7. This kind of starts the sequence of moves that he needs for this position. We do see the move d5. Rook comes down to e4. We see d6. King goes to e8. We see d7 with check, and then the king goes on d8. What Nakamura has decided to do is use his king to blockade, and he has kept his rook free. So not only does he have like complete movability with his rook, he also has this rook on this file, and it is preventing the king from being able to like really step out and kind of join in the action. So this is a much more active situation than using your rook to blockade the pawn. You don't really want to kind of tie your rook down to that type of thing because you want to use your powerful piece for some power, right? So we do see the move b3. We got to protect that pawn on a4. The rook comes up to e6. We see the move h4. We got g5, pawn takes d5, pawn takes g5, and then we do see rook up to d5. Wesley is deciding that he wants to start to kind of go after some pawns instead of being like really passive and defensive. So we do see the rook going to b6. We see rook takes g5, rook takes b3. We see rook taking h5, and then we see the move f3. And I will caution you in this position, do not get mated. Because if you do nothing, or you like move g3 or g4 or make a rook move or do anything, this pawn is protecting this square. So you do not want this rook to drop back and checkmate you. So seeing that, Wesley said, hey, man, I'll go ahead and double my pawns and take on f3. Of course, black is going to be taking this back. Rook takes back on f3. We got rook over to d5. We got the move b5. Pawn takes. We got pawn takes. And then the king comes up to e2. We got rook back to f6. Rook takes b5. We see rook to e6 with check. Just kind of tossing the check in there because why not? This is a rapid game, so it's about 10 to 12 minutes is how much time they have for the game. So, I mean, it's not a bullet game, but it is a lot faster than the classical games that they're playing. So the king goes to f3. We see king taking d7. And then we see the king coming up to f4. And as you can see, everything is pretty dead even. This is a very drawable type of an endgame as black, even though you are down a pawn. We do see the rook coming down to e2. We see king down to f3. Rook goes back up to e6. We see rook down to b4. And after the rook comes to f6 with check, you see why rook to b4 was made. The rook slides over to f4. And we kind of have like a bridge, like a reverse bridge, building a bridge situation like as part of the Lucena position. But we do see the move rook to h6. And this is absolutely correct. In this position, Hikaru Nakamura does not want to trade pieces down because In this particular situation, if the rook takes on f4 and the king takes on f4, then white is in a completely winning endgame with the king and pawn versus king. So he very smartly avoids that. The rook goes over to e4. We see rook over to f6 with check. The king goes to g3. The rook goes to g6 with check. And you guys see the bar kind of going crazy. I'm going to get into that in a second. The king goes to h4. The rook goes back to f6, but we are allowed to push f4 in this position. The rook goes back to f8. We see the king going to g5. Rook goes to g8 with check. The king goes to h6, and then we see the rook come down to g4. We see king down to h5 attacking that rook. So, you know, of course, they can't maintain that. The rook goes back up to g8, and then we do see the move f5. And it is in this position that Hikaru Nakamura resigns the game. And I will go into one variation as to, you know, why Hikaru Nakamura was on the game. Because like I said, pretty much up to this point, up until like a few moves ago, it was pretty drawn. You know, it was pretty even game. You know, just make sure you defend and stuff like that. I mean, you should be good to go. So, you know, thinking about that it was drawn, you know, you might be thinking like, why is the game over now though? Because if it's still, you can still draw it. Like, it doesn't seem like anything has changed. Well, the problem is white is in such a powerful position in this situation that they are able to force a win. And I will show you what one of those variations look like. If you decide to step in front of the pawn with the rook would go to f8. You see king to g6. The rook would go to g8 with check. The king would go over to f7. And now you have a problem. You know, do you move this rook along here? Or do you just kind of go down? Because, I mean, of course, if you go over here, the king is going to go to g7 and you have covered all three of these squares. So the rook is going to have to move somewhere. So, you know, one plan would be to try to come behind the pawn. We're going to rook to g3. And then after we see the move f6, the rook would go over to f3 and then the rook would go to d4. You want to try to like move that king over just a little bit. After the king comes over to c6, you would be seeing king to e7, rook to e3 with check, king going to f8. And then the rook coming down to f3, and then we do see the move f7. So as you guys are familiar with the Lucena position, probably if you've studied, you know, Lucena positions in rook endgames, this is, you know, one of the positions that you can get into. And so basically the next step that you need is building the bridge. So if we start to progress, you know, progress in that direction, you would probably see rook to g3 from black because they want to prevent your rook from swinging over here. Because if you can successfully get the rook on this file, then that means that you can sidestep your king with the rook blocking, and you're going to force, you know, black to give away their rook for this pawn. And then, of course, you just have a king and pawn, or a king and rook versus king endgame, which is completely winning. So the king comes down to e7. The rook goes to e3 with check. The king goes to f6. The rook goes back over to f3 with check. And there's a specific way that you want to go about, you know, allowing yourself to be checked and moving yourself into a specific position. So, of course, holding onto the pawn on f7, you move over to g6 with the king. And then after you receive this check, you now make your final maneuver in the process of building the bridge, going down to f5 with the king. And then after you get this final check on f3, you would be seeing the rook sliding over to f4, and you have successfully built the bridge as part of the Lucena position, as you guys know is the key to all rook endgames. And you have now just set it up to where you have blocked all remaining checks. And black has an option whether they want to just go ahead and attack here or move away. But you have done what you needed to do to make sure that in very soon you are going to be forcing this pawn up and you are going to be promoting your piece. So like I said, whether the rook wants to go ahead and go do this here, you're going to be promoting. Or if the rook just wants to kind of like move away or do something, I mean, there's nothing that black is going to be able to do to prevent this pawn from promoting. So you either have a rook and a queen or just a queen and a king against the king. It's all completely winning. Any of you guys that know the basic checkmates, you know, in the end games, you guys know that that is completely won. That's just a superior amount of material. So in light of that, backing all the way up to f5, this is something that Hikaru Nakamura can calculate in his mind. He's played in games. He's good at in games enough to know that this is a completely lost game. And so he went ahead and just resigned the game. So there is that. I appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. And I'll see you guys next time.